One oak table, two locked eyes, 11 words that stop time. The president leaned forward, but not in curiosity. He clenched his fist. His jaw stiffened. And then he slammed the table. Not because she disrespected him, but because Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez dared to say what no one else would. In a room full of titles and egos, it wasn't the loudest voice that turned history on its head. It was the calmest one. The Secret Service flinched. The cameras kept rolling. And the truth, it echoed louder than any gavel ever could. Because sometimes it only takes 11 words to undo 11 years of silence. This is a dramatized story. But if you've ever been dismissed for speaking up, if you've ever been told your voice was too small, too angry, too late, then you already know the facts may be fiction, but the emotion is real. And tonight we don't just tell a story. We remember why some voices shake power and why some truths were never meant to stay quiet. The envelope was ivory white, no seal, no stamp. Just one handwritten line in thick black ink, Miss Ocasio-Cortez. Your presence is requested. At first she thought it was a prank. Then her chief of staff turned pale. It's real, he whispered. The White House. Ethics Roundtable. Live streamed. With him. A beat of silence. The room filled with quiet questions. No one dared speak aloud. Why her why now? What was he planning? AOC didn't flinch. She looked down at the card again. A flicker in her eyes, not fear, not pride, something sharper resolve. She tucked the invitation into her blazer pocket. I'll go, she said quietly. Her team erupted into protest. He's baiting you. It's a trap. This is their setup, Alexandria. They want to humiliate you live. But she simply raised a hand, not to silence them, to center herself. When power invites you into its house, she said, you don't ask if the floor is rigged. You plant your heels and you make sure the walls remember your name. Cut to Roosevelt Room 2, 4:47 p.m. the following day. Dark oak panels lined the walls like silent witnesses. The ceiling lights were low, casting golden shadows that stretched like claws across the long table. Reporters buzzed behind velvet ropes. Cameras glinted. A quiet hum filled the air, the sound of America leaning in to listen. And at the head of the table, in a seat that wasn't his by design but by domination, sat Donald J. Trump. He didn't smile. He didn't look up. He just drummed his fingers on the wood, slow, sharp, deliberate. To his left, a row of GOP senators, Cruz, McConnell, Hawley. To his right, a Bible, an American flag pin, and an empty chair, until she walked in. No music, no fanfare, just the unmistakable click of heels on marble, steady, unfaltering. Alexandria stepped into the frame like a scalpel sliding across silk. Her blazer was midnight navy, her expression unreadable. And when she sat down, not a single eye in the room could pretend she didn't belong there. Trump finally looked up, a faint smirk. Well, he said, voice dripping with performance. Didn't expect you to accept the invite. She didn't blink. You invited America, she replied. I'm just the one who showed up. A single camera zoomed in, tight, almost intrusive. Somewhere, millions of viewers leaned forward. Twitter began to shake. Comment sections filled with, did she just? But there was something off. The air felt too still, too staged. Beneath the table, her hand grazed the underside of the chair and touched something metal, a tiny switch. She didn't react, but inside a question flared like a match. Why was her seat wired? And then, as the president opened his notes, she noticed it just for a second. The document he read from wasn't about ethics. It was titled Strategic Exposure. The AOC interruption. Her blood ran cold. Not from fear, from clarity. This wasn't a discussion. This was an ambush. And she had just walked straight into the belly of it with every camera in the country watching. The Roosevelt Room had never looked more choreographed. Beneath its antique oil paintings and the looming gaze of past presidents, a rectangular table gleamed like a chessboard. At its head, Donald Trump sat with a crooked smile, a smile that didn't greet so much as measure. The room was packed, but the air felt like it belonged to him alone. He leaned forward, elbows resting arrogantly on the table. We're gathered here today to discuss ethics, he said, dragging out the word like it offended his mouth. And who better to challenge that concept than Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez? A few polite chuckles from the Republican side of the room. The camera panned just enough to catch smirks from Senators Hawley and Cruz, who sat poised like theater critics at a Broadway preview. AOC, seated at the opposite end, didn't flinch. Her hands were still, her eyes steady. But inside, she'd already clocked it, the staging, the lights aimed for drama, not dialogue, and the carefully curated crowd. There were no union workers or public school teachers here, no working mothers or dreamers, just polished suits and practiced grins. Trump continued, turning to the press like a maestro guiding his strings. "I've always believed in open debate," he said, his voice oozing false benevolence. "But some folks confuse a Twitter account with a resume." More laughter, this time louder, a calculated beat of humiliation. That's when AOC noticed it. Her chair was slightly shorter than the others, her microphone oddly angled away. She subtly reached for it, adjusted the angle, and heard a faint click, not from the mic but beneath the table. She glanced down. Taped under the wood was a second device, smaller, matte black, blinking red. A recording unit. Hidden. She exhaled slowly, then leaned back. Of course, this wasn't a conversation, it was a trap dressed as a symposium. A televised ambush staged to corner her between policy and perception, to paint her as the radical, the outsider, the reckless mouthpiece of a generation that just doesn't know how the world works. Senator Blackburn chimed in next, her tone dripping with faux concern. "Congresswoman, you speak of justice, but do you truly believe dismantling police funding is what keeps communities safe? Or is that just applause line politics?" AOC didn't look at her. Instead, she let her eyes sweep across the room, from the men flipping through pre-written cue cards to the assistants in the corner typing feverishly into live feeds. And finally to Trump, who was watching her not like a rival, but like a producer, waiting for her to break character. "I just want to make sure," she said calmly, her voice cutting through the room like glass, "that we're not confusing ethics with theater." For a second, the room blinked. The cameras were still. The smiles faltered. Trump narrowed his eyes. AOC smiled. In that moment, she knew she wasn't the one being recorded. They were. The silence that followed her remark was the kind that didn't settle, it swirled. For half a beat, no one spoke. Cameras held their breath. Trump blinked just once, then leaned forward as if trying to recalculate the narrative. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had already seized the floor, not with volume, but with precision. She adjusted the collar of her blazer ever so slightly and said clearly, "Are we here to seek truth or to bury it?" It wasn't a challenge, it was a scalpel. The room tensed. Trump's expression twitched just enough for those watching closely to notice. He wasn't expecting her to come out swinging. Not like this. Not with a calm so composed it unsettled even the loudest mouse around the table. His playbook had always counted on outrage, on triggering a reaction. But AOC didn't take the bait. She offered something far more dangerous: clarity. "I didn't come here to throw punches," she continued, her eyes meeting each person across the table. "But I won't pretend this is a fair game either. I see the extra mic under my seat. I know what's edited and what gets buried. So before we go further, let me ask again for the record, are we here to seek truth or to bury it?" A murmur flickered across the room. One of the interns near the back lowered their phone. Even Senator Graham leaned in. AOC didn't wait for their answer. She had her own. "You want to talk about ethics," she said. "Let's start in the Bronx." She didn't raise her voice, but her words built momentum, like a wave building beneath the surface. "I grew up watching my father work 2 jobs just to keep a 1-bedroom apartment warm through winter. I watched my mother come home from cleaning houses and still find the strength to teach me algebra. I saw neighbors get evicted for being 24 hours late on rent. And you know what kept us going? A belief. A belief that if you worked hard, told the truth, and stood up when it mattered, this country would make room for you." She paused. No one moved. "Then I watched as banks stole homes. I watched as justice was traded for lobbyists and headlines. And now I sit here in this very room where truth is staged like theater and power is wielded like a club, not to protect, but to intimidate." Her voice didn't crack. It glowed. "You call this an ethics roundtable. But look around, there are no nurses here, no coal miners, no single moms. Just a lineup of people who've mistaken performance for principle." Trump's fingers began to drum lightly on the table, the first sign of visible agitation. This wasn't going according to plan. He opened his mouth to interject, but she held the air in her hand like a maestro holding the final note. "You say I don't know how the world works. But the world I've seen doesn't work unless people like me speak up." And then a shift. It was subtle but real. One of the studio lights reflected off the tears in a young woman's eyes seated among the controlled audience. A staffer in the back looked down ashamed. Even a few GOP aides stopped typing. AOC had landed her first strike, and she hadn't shouted once. She had reminded them of something they'd all learned to forget, that truth, when spoken without fear, doesn't need a microphone. It echoes on its own. The hum of tension in the room was now electric. The floor lights overhead glared like interrogation lamps, casting long shadows under the brows of every person seated. Behind the oak table, beneath the gilded seal of the presidency, Trump leaned back slightly in his chair, lips curled into a bemused smirk, as if the storm AOC had just summoned was nothing more than a passing drizzle. But the cameras were rolling, and cameras, unlike men, don't blink. Journalists in the room, seasoned and sharp, knew the stakes. Their pens were still, their eyes shifting rapidly from Alexandria to Trump and back again. No one wanted to miss a twitch, a wince, a loaded breath. A close-up shot on C-SPAN caught the corner of AOC's mouth tightening as she glanced across the room, a brief flick of her eyes to the press pool. She had noticed something they hadn't meant her to notice. On the far left side of the room, beside the main AV technician's booth, a small red light above one of the live feeds suddenly blinked out. Seconds later, a voice, steady, powerful, and unmistakably black, cut through the airwaves with poise. And if we're talking about ethics, let's be honest about who these policies actually hurt, because communities like mine, we've been click. The voice vanished mid-sentence. The studio feed switched abruptly to another angle, a glossy, wide shot of Trump chuckling with a senator. The sudden silence from the commentator panel was jarring. Viewers at home wouldn't know what just happened. But AOC saw it, and she remembered. That voice had belonged to Lionel Hayes, a respected black political analyst from Georgia, known for his incisive takes and unapologetic truth-telling. He had only spoken 20 seconds, barely enough to clear his throat before the mic feed had gone cold. Alexandria didn't flinch, but her mind was already processing. Someone had decided his voice didn't belong in this room. That wasn't a tech glitch. That was deliberate. Across from her, Trump whispered something to Senator Blackburn, who let out a snide chuckle. AOC caught the look, condescension disguised as amusement. She didn't move, but her spine straightened by half an inch. She had come into this room expecting unfairness, expecting spin. But not this level of open manipulation. Cutting off a black voice on live TV. This wasn't just a stage-managed hearing, it was a broadcasted ambush. In the background, a young white intern fiddled nervously with an earpiece. Another technician held a clipboard to his chest, his eyes avoiding the screen where the feed had been cut. AOC made a mental note of the timestamp. Behind the polished setup, she now saw the wiring, the machinery, the choices. Every word she would say from this point on would not just be for the audience in the room. It would be for the millions watching, those who would notice the edits, who would catch the missing pieces, who would understand what it means when the truth gets trimmed in real time. And she also knew silence could be louder than sound. The fact that Lionel was cut would speak volumes if she knew how to shine light on it. So she didn't speak immediately. She waited just long enough for the room to settle, for viewers to realize something had changed. And when she leaned in toward her mic again, she didn't raise her voice, but her tone had shifted. Colder, sharper, calculated. Because now she wasn't just speaking truth. She was watching who was afraid of it. The room shifted again, subtly but perceptibly. After AOC's piercing calm had unsettled the floor, a senior advisor stepped forward. Clean-cut suit sharp enough to slice tension, voice dipped in rehearsed confidence. His name was Douglas Ware, a former analyst at a conservative think tank now quietly embedded in the president's inner circle. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and began reading. According to data compiled over a 12-month period, neighborhoods with high immigrant density are statistically more prone to violent crime. Drug-related offenses, school dropouts, and domestic instability have all shown measurable increases. The numbers don't lie. He looked up, eyes scanning the room, waiting for the moment those words would land like punches. Some in the crowd nodded. Others, less sure, scribbled notes. Cameras zoomed in, not on Ware, but on AOC. She didn't blink. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as though she had just been handed a children's puzzle with the wrong pieces jammed together. A quiet breath then. Numbers don't scare me, but manipulation does. The advisor opened his mouth perhaps to object, but she didn't give him space. You see, data is only as honest as the hand that selects it. You want to talk about crime? Let's talk about patterns. Let's talk about who collects this data and what they choose to leave out. The room froze. Trump leaned forward slightly, sensing something building. Alexandria's voice didn't rise, but it deepened. It carried the gravity of memory. In Minneapolis, George Floyd's neck was crushed for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. Was that crime not in the database? Was the knee of a state actor not considered violence? A few people in the back shifted in their seats. In Louisville, Breonna Taylor was shot while asleep. No knock, no warning, no conviction. Is that part of your metrics? Did her dreams make the spreadsheet? She let the silence settle like ash after fire. These aren't isolated stories. They are patterns, wounds that never got counted. You say you're giving us numbers. I say you're hiding behind them. Someone coughed. A pen slipped from a journalist's fingers. She wasn't finished. I've walked the Bronx. I've met single mothers who work 3 jobs and still get blamed for the economy. I've spoken to teenagers stopped and searched because of the color of their skin, not their behavior. And each time someone like you says, statistically, what you mean is strategically you cherry-pick pain and weaponize it. Trump narrowed his eyes. He wasn't used to being outflanked with facts and empathy. She turned to Ware again. You want to impress this room? Give me the names behind your numbers. Where are they? What were their stories, or do they vanish once they prove your point? Ware said nothing. His papers, so confidently stacked moments ago, now sat idle in his hand. And somewhere in the back, one of the previously silent attendees, an older black woman, nodded just once, tears pooling, but not falling. AOC saw her. She didn't smile. She didn't grandstand. She simply turned back to her mic, composed and still. We're not here to be fed fear disguised as fact. We're here to reclaim truth. One life, one voice, one name at a time. And just like that, the statistical attack had crumbled not from counter data, but from human weight, the kind spreadsheets can never carry. She had just finished speaking, the room still quivering from the weight of her final words. Not a single soul dared to clap. Applause would have broken something sacred. Then it came a soft, almost imperceptible sound from the far corner of the room. Coo, a light cough, brittle and hollow. It wasn't disruptive, but it cut through the silence like a cracked bell echoing in an empty church. AOC glanced sideways. Then another sound followed this one, softer still, a kind of crumpling. It wasn't paper. It was grief. An elderly man seated just behind the second row of hand-picked guests had lowered his head into his trembling hands. His shoulders rose once then again. He wasn't sobbing aloud, not the kind of grief that demands attention, but the kind that spills quietly from a soul trying its best to contain decades of buried pain. She noticed. She didn't return to her prepared remarks. She didn't pivot into a counterattack. Instead, she took a step closer to the mic. Her voice, when it came, was low and reverent. There are some stories, she said, eyes now lifting from the old man and turning toward the camera's red blinking light you cannot interrupt with applause. Her breath caught for a moment, not out of nerves but out of reverence. Only with silence. The phrase hovered, suspended in the air. The cameras didn't cut away. No Chiron ran across the screen. For the first time that night, the media apparatus froze alongside the humans in the room. Then, like the slow ripple of wind through dry grass, something began to shift in the crowd. A young staffer sitting near the edge of the platform took off her headset. A woman in a navy blue pantsuit leaned over and gently gripped her husband's hand. And from the back, where security personnel stood as still as statues, one of them, a black officer in his late 40s, blinked hard and turned away for a moment, hiding his face from the lens. AOC didn't move, because this wasn't a moment to seize, it was a moment to respect. It was the breath between storms, the hush before transformation. She understood the paradox. The deeper the truth cut, the quieter the room became. Trump sat motionless, fingers steepled, unsure whether to break the pause or let it stretch. For all his stagecraft, he had never mastered this kind of silence, the kind that humbled even power. AOC's gaze returned to the man who had wept. She didn't ask his name. She didn't turn him into a symbol. But in that brief connection, a glance that lasted less than a second, she gave him something, no statistic, no headline, no Senate floor ran ever had. Dignity. And in return, something strange happened. The crowd, primed for spectacle, became still with shared reverence. The lines dividing left and right, insider and outsider, official and observer, they softened. Not vanished, but softened. Because what they had just witnessed wasn't politics. It was presence. And just before she continued, a whisper from the crowd, so faint it might have been missed, made its way forward. "She's not speaking for us," someone murmured. "She's speaking with us." AOC inhaled deeply, not to speak again just yet, but to hold this fragile, flickering stillness just a moment longer. And the cameras, they didn't blink. It started just as she thought they had found a strange moment of stillness. Trump leaned forward. The room was quiet again. Not the reverent silence from before, but the kind of sharp stillness that happens when someone flips the script. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pound the table. He just narrowed his eyes, folded his arms, and asked the question as if it were the most casual thing in the world. "So tell me, Congresswoman," a pause, "do you love this country?" It wasn't a question. It was bait barbed with history, sharpened by decades of dog whistles, and wrapped in the red, white, and blue of performance patriotism. The kind of question designed not to illuminate, but to trap. The room froze. Everyone knew the game had just shifted. This wasn't a debate on policy anymore. It was a test of allegiance, a gauntlet wrapped in the flag and thrown at her feet. The GOP senators smirked. Some nodded slowly as if to say, "Finally, we've got her." Even the cameras seemed to zoom in tighter, not on Trump, but on AOC's face. Waiting, calculating, wondering what her eyes would do before her mouth said a word. She didn't blink. Instead, she let the silence grow heavy, not avoiding the question, but allowing it to stretch just long enough for everyone to hear what it really meant. Then came the smallest smile, not smug, not sarcastic, but knowing. And finally she answered. Enough to question it, she said, her voice calm, deliberate. Enough to want it to be better. Her tone didn't rise. She didn't throw her words like daggers. She laid them down like bricks, solid, intentional, impossible to ignore. Trump squinted. He wasn't sure if she had dodged the question or detonated it, but the room knew, because in those 8 words she had rewritten the entire premise. To question your country wasn't betrayal, it was devotion. To ask it to be better wasn't condemnation, it was hope. She wasn't outside the American story. She was fighting to write a new chapter. A younger aide in the corner let out the faintest exhale. It sounded like relief. One of the audience members, an older Latina woman in a church hat and pearls, mouthed the word yes with tears brimming. Trump leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping the table in a subtle, uneven rhythm. He had asked the wrong question, or perhaps the right one, but to the wrong woman. AOC didn't continue right away. She let her answer settle like dust on polished wood. She wanted people to sit with it, to feel the discomfort of realizing that love, true love, isn't always polite. It demands, it confronts, it pushes. And just before the moderator could move to the next topic, AOC added one more line, softer this time. Blind loyalty is not the measure of love. The courage to speak truth, even when it's unpopular, is. In a country where dissent was too often painted as betrayal, where critique was confused with contempt, her words didn't just challenge the room, they challenged the narrative. Trump had changed the rules, but AOC had changed the meaning. The air was tense. Not the theatrical tension of political theater, but something far more dangerous, the kind of thick electric quiet that only comes before an eruption. AOC had just redefined what it meant to love a country, but she wasn't done, not even close. She leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, fingers gently touching. Around her, the room held its breath. Even Trump had fallen silent, though not in defeat, but in calculation. She could feel it, that rising tide behind his eyes, the urge to dominate, to regain control of the spectacle he believed he owned. The moderator stammered, unsure whether to move forward or retreat. But AOC spoke again, her voice low, steady, and piercing. Power is loudest when it tries hardest to silence the truth. 11 words, 11 quiet detonations wrapped in velvet, delivered without theatrics, and yet somehow more explosive than any shout. For a beat, no one moved. It was as if the sound had cracked something invisible in the room. Then came the noise. Trump slammed the table. The sound echoed like a gunshot off the oak-paneled walls, jolting the room into chaos. Several aides flinched. One senator gasped audibly. The cameras, all six of them, zoomed in instinctively, capturing the precise frame that would play on every news channel before nightfall. Trump red-faced and livid. AOC unshaken, unblinking. "You come in here and throw around slogans," he barked, his voice cracking with fury. "You think you can preach to me about truth," but the audience wasn't with him anymore. Because those 11 words had already left his reach. They had slipped under his control, past his branding, past his bravado, and landed straight in the hearts of millions watching at home. Somewhere in Detroit, a mother of three whispered them to herself over her kitchen sink. In Phoenix, a retired veteran paused his TV mid-sentence, then rewound it. In Atlanta, a student screenshot the quote, fingers shaking slightly, and tweeted, That's the moment. I'll never forget it." Trump's rage wasn't just emotional, it was strategic collapse. He realized in real time that he had been outmaneuvered, not with volume, but with clarity. She hadn't insulted him. She hadn't accused him. She had simply held up a mirror and let the truth scream through the reflection. AOC didn't gloat. She didn't flinch or smirk. Instead, she sat still, like the calm in the eye of a storm she no longer feared. Behind her, one of the hand-picked audience members, a school teacher with kind eyes and trembling hands, scribbled the quote in a notebook she hadn't used in years. The power of those 11 words wasn't in their poetry. It was in their precision. In a room designed to humiliate her, she had landed a blow so quiet, so exact, that it shattered the foundation of the whole performance. And the irony was unbearable. Trump had tried to silence her with spectacle. But in doing so, he had amplified her message beyond his wildest fears. As the moderator tried to calm the room, as aides whispered frantically into earpieces, as Trump's voice grew hoarse with indignation, AOC did something that no one expected. She looked straight into the main camera, and she smiled. Not with triumph, but with recognition, the kind of smile that says, "You heard it, you felt it, and you'll remember." Because sometimes it only takes 11 words to wake a nation. It started with a blink, the millisecond delay between when something seismic happens on live television and when the world catches it. But once it did, there was no stopping it. The clip, 43 seconds long, began with AOC's calm, piercing voice and ended with Trump's fist slamming the desk. The words were crystalline, delivered without anger or drama, but somehow more devastating than either. Power is loudest when it tries hardest to silence the truth. Within 2 minutes, it was on Twitter. At 5 minutes, it hit Instagram, layered over black and white footage of peaceful protests, cracked microphones, news anchors cut mid-sentence. By the 20th minute, it was everywhere. CNN tried to avoid looping it too often, afraid of the backlash, but independent accounts took it further. One veteran journalist captioned the moment, "I've covered 7 presidents. This is the most honest sentence ever spoken in that room." And then came the hashtags 11 words. It wasn't from a major influencer or media outlet. It was from a retired school teacher in Topeka, Kansas. Her post was simple, a selfie holding her old chalkboard with the quote written across it in shaky cursive. The caption read, "I spent 32 years trying to teach this." She said it in 5 seconds. It caught fire. Nurses on night shift began filming themselves in empty corridors, whispering the quote between IV rounds. A union leader from Pittsburgh tweeted a photo of his broken hard hat with the caption, "Truth doesn't wear a suit. It wears scars." A former Marine Purple Heart pinned to his chest posted a video in front of a faded American flag. He spoke softly. "I didn't serve to protect a government that shouts down truth. I served to protect a people who dare to speak it." The screen faded to black with just one line, hashtags 11 words. Within hours, the hashtag had crossed 1 million posts, then 5, then 12. But this wasn't just trend chasing. These were stories, raw, aching, unedited accounts from Americans who had been told to sit down, stay quiet, follow orders. People who had seen lies elevated and truth dismissed. People who had tasted silence, not as peace, but as punishment. One Latina mother in Arizona filmed her video from a cramped living room while her children played in the background. Her voice cracked as she said, "They told me not to speak Spanish at the hospital, that it made people uncomfortable. But my son, he only knew how to ask for help in Spanish." She looked into the camera. I'm not uncomfortable anymore. There were tears in thousands of clips, but also pride, courage, a strange sense of collective awakening. AOC herself didn't post anything that night. No retweet, no press release. She remained still, letting the words live on their own, untouched by political machinery. And yet something in the silence made the moment even more profound. Because what the country was beginning to understand slowly, painfully, was that truth does not need permission to rise. It only needs someone willing to speak it. 11 words, that's all it took. Not to trend, not to go viral, but to remind a nation what it sounds like to feel seen. The morning after the moment, the sky over Washington was a steely gray, heavy with something more than weather. Across the city, cable newsrooms scrambled, inboxes flooded, and the words AOC and traitor were threaded together like venom through a digital bloodstream. On Fox, the chyron beneath a scowling anchor read, Congresswoman or comrade. Clips of AOC's statement, power is loudest when it tries hardest to silence the truth, were dissected, reworded, stripped of context, then weaponized. One commentator, red-faced and loud, shouted, she's not challenging power. She is the problem. That's not bravery, that's betrayal. The words hung there and they multiplied. In another segment, a guest casually suggested that AOC's district deserves better than someone who questions the very soil she walks on. An online column accused her of inciting intellectual rebellion. The implication was clear. She hadn't just spoken out, she had stepped out of line. But it wasn't just media. At 10:42 a.m., her personal email pinged. The subject line was typed in all caps, "We're watching you." She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She'd seen enough over the years to know what came next. An hour later, a hand-addressed envelope arrived at her Capitol Hill office. No return address. Inside was a crumpled newspaper clipping of her speech with a single phrase scribbled across it in red Sharpie. The tree of liberty must be refreshed. It wasn't subtle. By noon, her team had locked down internal communication. A junior staffer, barely 24, quietly took down his family photos from his desk, just in case he whispered. But the harshest blow came at 3:14 p.m. That's when she saw a public post from a fellow Democrat, a friend, someone who once stood with her on climate legislation, who had marched with her through the Bronx during those humid, uncertain summers of protest. The post didn't name her directly. It didn't have to. It read, "Some people are more interested in headlines than helping their country." A gut punch in 12 words. She stared at the screen, unmoving. Not angry, just quiet, like someone watching a bridge they built plank by plank burn down without warning. Outside her window, a soft drizzle began tapping against the glass, like the first notes of a storm not yet fully arrived. She turned back to her desk. Dozens of new messages blinked, some hateful, some pleading. A few simply said, "Thank you." But one stood out from a nurse in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It read, "They can threaten you, but they can't unhear you. That's the thing about truth. It echoes." AOC closed her eyes. She wasn't afraid of storms. She had grown up in them. What rattled her was how fast lightning could turn the sky, how silence could return just as fast, pretending nothing had happened. But something had happened. The walls of comfort were cracking. The script was broken. And the storm wasn't just outside, it was inside the building, inside the very conversation. And if she had to walk through it alone, then so be it. Because once you say the truth out loud, you can't pretend you didn't. It was past midnight. The Capitol had gone quiet, its grand hallways emptied of noise, but still echoing with the residue of a turbulent day. Outside her office window, the rain had turned into a steady rhythm, like a metronome marking the passing of a moment she hadn't yet processed. AOC sat alone at her desk, the glow of her reading lamp casting a soft circle of light over the mess of papers, clippings, and unopened emails. Her blazer hung from the back of her chair like a weary flag, her phone face down. The silence was both a comfort and a threat. She opened the bottom drawer, the one she rarely touched. Inside was a simple shoebox wrapped in rubber bands, a quiet archive of a life most people in that building had never seen. She pulled it onto her lap and slowly peeled it open. Inside were letters, yellowed envelopes addressed in looping, slanted handwriting. Her mother's handwriting. She had started writing them when Alexandria was still bartending back in the Bronx, before campaigns and microphones, before insults wrapped in policy. Each letter was a lifeline sent across time, penned in late-night hours, after double shifts and quiet worry. She picked one. No date on the envelope, just for the days that feel too loud. She unfolded it with care. The paper trembled slightly between her fingers. The ink had smudged in one corner, as if from a tear long dried. My cores and I know you're louder than they expect. Don't let the room define your voice. Speak even when your hands shake, especially then. AOC exhaled slowly. She hadn't realized how much of herself she'd been holding in since the moment Trump pounded the table. Since the threats. Since the betrayal from a colleague who once called her sister. She hadn't cried, hadn't even paused long enough to admit how much it all cracked at her armor. But now, in this moment of stillness, in the warm breath of her mother's words, something inside her softened. Not to break, but to feel. She thought about that room earlier, how the lights were too bright, the air too controlled, the performance choreographed with surgical precision. She remembered the smug looks, the planted questions the crowd pre-selected to clap at cruelty. She remembered holding her ground anyway. But now alone, she allowed herself to ask the question that no headline ever printed. What if they're right? What if this country doesn't want to be questioned? What if justice, real justice, isn't loud enough to compete with fear? Her hand rested over the last line of the letter, fingers pressing into the curve of her mother's final words. You come from women who spoke before they were allowed to. That blood doesn't run cold. A small, almost involuntary smile touched her lips. She whispered aloud to no one but herself, and neither do I. Outside, the rain eased. The storm was not gone, just resting, like her. AOC folded the letter gently, placed it back in its envelope, and returned the box to its drawer. Then she stood up, straightened her shoulders, and turned off the lamp. Not because the night was over, but because morning was coming. It was a quiet Thursday morning, the kind that feels like the city is still half asleep. The sky outside was overcast, a dull silver, stretching over Washington like a thick curtain. AOC had arrived early. She liked the solitude of morning before the day's demands began pulling at her from all directions. She was still settling in when her staffer Rachel knocked gently and poked her head in. There's a gentleman here to see you, she said, her voice soft. Didn't give a name. Said he's not press. Said he's served. AOC looked up, curious. Let him in. The door opened, and in stepped a man who looked like he carried the weight of several wars, even if he didn't say so. He was dressed plainly, old boots, pressed shirt, a cap tucked under his arm. His skin was deep brown, lined with time. His eyes calm, but full of something unspeakable. He didn't ask for a seat, didn't pull out a phone, didn't flash a smile for a photo op. He just nodded once in acknowledgement, and she stood to meet him. I hope it's all right I came, he said. Of course, AOC replied, motioning toward the chair across from her desk. Please. He sat down slowly, taking his time, folding his cap into his hands. He didn't speak for a moment, just studied her, not in judgment, but with a kind of quiet reverence. I watched the hearing, he finally said. Every second. She offered a polite smile, the kind she'd grown used to giving strangers, a cautious, professional, grateful. But something about the man in front of her made her soften. I thought I might recognize you from the news, she said gently. I ain't from the news, he replied. I'm from Montgomery. She nodded, waiting. He looked down, rubbed the brim of his cap. Then without ceremony, he said, My father marched next to King in '65. I wore this country's uniform in Fallujah. My nephew got stopped and searched 4 times in 1 week last year for walking with his hands in his pockets. Then he looked up, eyes locked onto hers. You didn't speak for the cameras, he said, his voice low, slow, steady. You spoke for people like me. AOC didn't answer right away. She felt the lump form in her throat, too fast to hide, too sacred to fight. The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a small folded photo worn at the edges. He placed it on the desk. In it, a younger version of himself stood next to an even younger boy, both saluting, both smiling. That's my grandson, he said. Saw you on TV and said, Grandpa. She said the thing we always say, but they finally had to hear it. She looked at the picture. She saw the pride, the cost, the generations bound by silence until someone dared to speak. The man stood. I won't take more of your time. You already gave me more than I thought I had left, she replied, rising to shake his hand. He took her hand with both of his. Firm, weathered, solid. No, ma'am, he said. You gave it to us, all of us. And just like that, he turned and walked out. No photo, no name. Just a quiet thank you that didn't need to be posted to matter. As the door clicked shut, AOC stood still. A single tear rolled down her cheek, not from pain, not even from joy, but from something older. Something called recognition. The wood-paneled chamber was alive with tension before AOC even entered. Cameras had already begun rolling. Microphones were live. Staffers whispered like wind moving through dry leaves. The hearing was scheduled to examine the new Human Rights and Civil Protections Act, a bill she had helped draft, a bill born from stories she had carried in her chest like old wounds. When she stepped into the room, a hush followed her like a tide receding. She walked with calm purpose, notebook in hand, sleeves rolled up, no theatrics. Just focus. Chairman Reeves gavelled the session into order. His voice was flat, but everyone knew this wasn't just another hearing. This was the collision. They were 10 minutes in when it began. Representative Clay Wensley from Tennessee, a seasoned GOP member with a permanent smirk and a binder full of pre-scripted outrage, leaned into his mic, voice syrupy and sharp. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, you propose a bill that you claim is about protecting civil liberties. And yet it is filled with vague language, emotional appeals, and cherry-picked statistics that paint America as the villain. Tell me, how exactly does this bill help Americans and not just, well, your base? The bait was obvious, but she didn't blink. Wensley didn't stop. He flipped through a document dramatically. According to your appendix, you cite an increase in civil rights violations. Yet according to the Heritage Freedom Index, incidents of such abuses are at a record low. Are you disputing that data, or do you just prefer sources that fit your narrative? AOC leaned into her mic, slowly looked directly at him, then let her gaze sweep across the room. She wasn't just answering him. She was speaking into history. Congressman, she began, her voice calm, deliberate. I prefer sources that reflect lived reality, not those designed to protect power from accountability. If you ask a child who's been separated from their parent, or a nurse who's lost her job for reporting abuse, or a protester who was blinded by a rubber bullet, what freedom index should they cite? A few heads turned. Some shifted in their seats. And by the way, she added, the Heritage Freedom Index doesn't include wrongful detentions, unlawful surveillance, or abuse in privately run immigrant detention centers. Convenient, isn't it? Wensley scoffed. So now we're redefining civil liberties based on feelings? No, she said, eyes steady. We're redefining accountability based on who's been left out of your data. There it was. The air thickened. C-SPAN's feed zoomed in. Wensley pressed on, trying to reclaim ground. You talk a lot about justice, but your bill allows people to sue federal officers individually. That's chaos. That's political theater disguised as reform. AOC responded without missing a beat. No, Congressman. That's consequence. And maybe the reason some people call it chaos is because they've never had to live without consequence. Silence. Sharp. Dense. Even the stenographer paused before catching up. The hearing resumed, but the balance had shifted. She didn't just defend the bill, she exposed why it needed to exist in the first place. It wasn't just words on paper anymore. It was a mirror. And in that moment, under the fluorescent glare of congressional lighting, it was clear to anyone watching, this wasn't about policy. It was about memory, about whose experience gets written into law and whose gets redacted. She didn't plan to read the letter, not at first. But when the debate turned sterile, reduced to legal clauses and red-stamped memos, she felt the pulse leaving the room. So she reached into her bag with a quiet steadiness, as though retrieving something sacred. A single folded sheet of paper, worn at the edges. She stood calm but unyielding, the way fire holds its shape in the wind. Before we continue, she said, voice soft but caring, I'd like to share something not from a think tank or policy journal, but from someone who has to live with what we decide in this room. A few staffers shifted uncomfortably. Wensley raised a brow. The chairman hesitated but didn't interrupt. Maybe he sensed what was coming didn't belong to protocol but to truth. AOC unfolded the page. It's a letter, she said, glancing down from a student in El Paso. His name is Mateo, 13 years old. His father was deported last year. She inhaled quietly, then began to read. Dear Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, we watched you on TV in class. Our teacher said you talk like you're not scared, but we know it's hard. Some kids here stop talking after their parents disappeared. Some say we don't belong. But when you talk, it's like someone finally sees us. Thank you for letting us exist on your microphone. The room fell still, not just quiet still, as if time had briefly stepped aside to make space for something more human than political. AOC looked up slowly. Her eyes weren't tearful, they were precise, focused. She wasn't trying to break down, she was trying to build through. This isn't about left or right, she said, folding the letter carefully. It's about whose voices we carry with us when the cameras stop. Mateo doesn't know how to lobby Congress. He doesn't have a PAC, but he still believes his voice can matter. That should shame us into doing better. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every word struck like iron against stone. She locked eyes with Wensley again, not in anger, but in quiet challenge. You wanted to know what this bill is about. It's about Mateo. It's about children growing up with fear as their bedtime story. It's about not letting policy erase people. Her tone remained even, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. It wasn't fury, it was controlled fire. The kind that doesn't burn recklessly, but reshapes what it touches. Cameras captured the moment, but the moment wasn't for cameras. It was for every voice that had been cut off mid-sentence, for every dream interrupted by handcuffs, for every family photo missing someone because of a policy inked without a second thought. As she sat down, no one clapped. They couldn't. There are some truths applause cannot honor. Only silence can. The vote was scheduled for 3:00 p.m., but by 2:50 the chamber felt like a pressure cooker of silence. No more speeches, no more posturing, just waiting. The bill H.R. 1123 was printed neatly in black ink, but its implications screamed in color. It proposed sweeping human rights protections, limiting solitary confinement, enhancing refugee pathways, and mandating federal oversight on racial profiling cases. To its critics, it was overreach. To its supporters, it was a lifeline. AOC sat still, hands folded in front of her. Not in prayer, in patience, like someone who had already spoken what needed to be said and now chose to listen even to the ticking clock. Then the roll call began. Ace came steady from her side of the aisle. Expected, practiced, believers. Nays echoed from across the aisle, equally predictable, until the 34th name. Representative Connor Wexley, the clerk, called. A slight shuffle. Heads turned. Wexley, a Republican from Ohio, former military, a law and order darling, stood without a word. The room froze. He looked at the screen above him, at the vote tally, at the bill name, then at AOC. He didn't nod, didn't smile, just pressed the green button. Aye. It was like a match being struck in a cave. Brief light, audible gasps. Someone actually dropped a pen. AOC blinked just once. The corners of her mouth didn't curl, but her fingers clenched, not in triumph, but in gravity. She knew what this meant. The tally climbed. 215 in favor, 215 against. Only one more vote remained. A Democrat from Kentucky, absent due to illness. The clerk waited, but time didn't. The final count, 215-216. The bill failed. By a single heartbeat. The chamber exhaled, but not in relief. It was the sound of history brushed, but not grasped. Wexley sat down slowly, ignoring the side eyes, and muttered curses from his own party. His hands trembled slightly, but he kept them visible, almost defiantly, atop his desk. Outside, news alerts exploded. Breaking GOP rep. Breaks ranks on human rights bill. I heard around the floor. Bill fails by one vote. One missing voice. Later that evening, when reporters mobbed him for an answer, Wexley simply said, I served overseas. I've seen what happens when people justify silence with order. That's not who I want to be. Back inside the chamber, AOC stood near the back wall. She wasn't giving interviews. She wasn't smiling. She simply looked at the vote board, then at the empty chair where the absent Democrat should have been. One more voice and they would have made history. But even in loss, something had shifted. The silence after the vote wasn't dismissal, it was reckoning. Some defeats echo louder than victories. And some moments crack the floor just enough for light to come through. The email had no subject, just a Google Drive link, sent from an encrypted address. No signature. AOC stared at it on her phone for a moment, hesitant. But curiosity had long since stopped being a luxury in her line of work. It was survival. She tapped. The audio file was only 47 seconds long, but 47 seconds can unravel a nation. The clip began mid-sentence. The voice was unmistakable, gravelly, boastful, too loud even in private. "I mean, come on," Trump said, followed by a laugh. "You think I care what she said?" It was theater. All of it, just a show for the cameras. There was a pause, then more laughter. Another voice, unidentifiable, added, "They're eating it up, though. That line, 'Power is loudest,' whatever, we should have written that ourselves." The recording ended with the sound of a Diet Coke can being cracked open. AOC didn't move, didn't blink. Her phone screen dimmed, then faded to black in her hand. The silence around her buzzed louder than the audio. She forwarded it to her chief of staff. No message. No need. Within minutes, the leak was verified. White House staff were scrambling. Networks got hold of it before the press secretary could craft a denial. By the time MSNBC played it on a loop, hashtags were already trending. Hashtags just a show, hashtags caught and tape, hashtags theater of power. America had seen many scandals, but this one hit different because it wasn't about corruption, it was about contempt. Not just for the opposition, but for the very people who watched, listened, hoped. That night, millions of viewers rewatched the original clip, the 11 words, the vote, the silence afterward with new ears. It wasn't just powerful, it was dismissed. And that betrayal hit home. Parents who told their kids, "Watch this woman, she's speaking for you," now found themselves choking back tears. Veterans who had written to their congresspeople now felt mocked. Teachers who had played the clip in civics class now stood before angry students, asking, was it really all fake? No, AOC thought. Not this. She released a short statement, not on camera, not in studio lighting, but sitting at her desk in a hoodie, tired eyes full of steel. When people say our democracy is just a performance, I say it becomes one only when we stop believing in it. I still believe, and I believe you do too. The video had no music, no graphics, just her voice, and somehow that made it louder. It started with one woman in Minneapolis, middle-aged Latina school bus driver. She stood at the corner of 38th and Chicago, where George Floyd had breathed his last, holding a cardboard sign that read, "She spoke. We heard." She said nothing, just stood. Then another joined her, and another. By dusk, the corner was full. The next morning, it was Boston nurses in blue scrubs holding similar signs outside Massachusetts General. Then Atlanta, a retired black veteran stood silently with his granddaughter, their signs scrawled with crayons. Truth isn't a show. By Friday, it was everywhere. Denver, Detroit, Des Moines. No political chants, no megaphones. Just presence, still steady, stubborn. Signs appeared in more languages than the news anchors could translate fast enough. Ella habló. Nosotros escuchamos. Ella parlé. Nous avons écouté. She spoke for me. On one corner in Oakland, a homeless man held up a sign made from a pizza box. It read, "First time I felt seen." In Tulsa, descendants of the 1921 massacre marched with signs, "Power mocked her. We won't." And in the Bronx, AOC's own district, entire school classes wrote letters. Some messy with colored pencils, some typed carefully with help from ESL teachers. Each addressed to a different member of Congress. Each letter began the same way we heard her. Did you phone lines at Capitol Hill jammed? Interns fielded call after call, not from lobbyists or big donors, but from farmers in Nebraska, janitors in Philly, high schoolers from El Paso. They didn't ask for favors. They didn't even ask for answers. They asked for dignity. One voicemail simply said, "I don't know much about politics, but I know when someone tells the truth. Don't punish her for it." News coverage couldn't keep up. Cameras tried to find the drama, but there was none. Just people showing up, standing still, refusing to look away. Even late-night hosts struggled to fit it into a segment, because it wasn't anger, it wasn't applause, it was recognition. A quiet growing chorus of Americans who had lived their whole lives unheard, now suddenly realizing the echo wasn't just in their heads. She said 11 words, one man told a reporter in Kansas. But what they did to her after, that's what made me act. The auditorium at Howard University was filled beyond capacity. Students spilled into aisles, sat on steps, leaned against walls. Some had been waiting since dawn. Faculty stood in the back, arms crossed, expressions quiet but expectant. The night air outside pulsed with a kind of electricity, not of spectacle, but of something earned. When AOC stepped onto the stage, she didn't raise her hands. She didn't wave. She just took a breath and looked out. And they saw her not as a headline or a hashtag, but as a woman carrying something that didn't quite belong to her alone anymore. She stepped to the podium, adjusted the mic, and said gently, "I don't come to preach." That's when the room fell fully silent. "I was a girl making coffee in the Bronx," she began, "and people told me I talked too much, that I asked the wrong questions, that I didn't know my place. But I learned something standing behind that counter. I learned how to listen. I learned that people don't want perfect answers, they want to be heard before they disappear." A student in the front row wiped tears without shame. She paused, then continued, her voice low but clear. "There was no magic door to Congress, no silver invitation. There was just a lot of pushing through doors people told me weren't mine to open." Scattered murmurs of rose from the back. Not performance, recognition. I remember the first time someone said I was too angry. Not because I raised my voice, but because I refused to lower it for their comfort. Now she smiled, just barely. "So I want to say this tonight, not as a congresswoman, not as a public figure, but as a daughter, as a sister, as someone who was told, 'Keep your head down, the world isn't ready for girls like you.'" She looked around the room, locking eyes with students in the farthest row. "But maybe the world never gets ready. Maybe we show up anyway." There was no eruption of applause. Not yet. Instead, a long inhale, like the entire room had just remembered its own breath. Then she said quietly, "If you ever find yourself with a microphone in a classroom, in a courtroom, in a barbershop, at a dinner table, don't waste it. Don't shrink. Don't imitate. Tell the truth you're afraid will make people uncomfortable, because that's probably the one that matters most." The room stayed hushed. Then one voice, strong and proud, called from the back, "Let her speak." Applause followed, but not the kind that breaks the moment. It carried it, like wind carries a song. And just before she stepped away from the podium, she said something soft, almost too soft for the mic to catch. "This isn't my story, it's ours. I just happen to be the one holding the mic, for now." It had been almost a year to the day. The names etched on the memorial wall shimmered faintly in the winter sunlight. Dozens of activists, journalists, and organizers lost in the crossfire of America's political unraveling. Some killed in marches, others driven to silence by threats that became violence. The ceremony was somber but not heavy. There was dignity in how they were remembered. Rows of black chairs faced the reflecting pool in Washington, D.C. A soft wind moved the flags slowly, like the country itself was exhaling, not in peace but in pause. AOC arrived in a dark navy coat, her posture calm, her heels soft against the gravel path. She greeted the mothers first, women holding framed photos, worn letters, buttons with names. She held their hands in both of hers, not rushing, not gesturing for cameras. Some whispered thanks. One just nodded and wouldn't let go for several seconds. No words needed. The program began with a violin solo, then a brief silence. Then the announcer said with a careful neutrality, "Please welcome former President Donald J. Trump." The crowd shifted. Cameras tilted. A few gasps. He walked to his seat near the center aisle, flanked by staff and Secret Service. No speech, just presence. A symbol, a shadow, a reminder. A few minutes later, the announcer spoke again. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She stepped forward slowly. The audience rose. Her eyes scanned the seats. She saw familiar faces, old colleagues, students, journalists. And she saw him sitting 3 rows ahead, unmoving, jaw-tight gaze fixed straight ahead. As she passed Trump's row, there was a moment, brief, silent, unscripted. She turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge him. Not with a nod, not with a smile, just presence. He didn't move, didn't offer his hand, and neither did she. It wasn't rudeness, it wasn't rebellion, it was something quieter, a choice. She stood at the podium, waited for the rustling to still. Then she said, "Some will tell you that America's about power. But what I've seen, what I've felt, is that this country's soul doesn't live in power. It lives in grief, in those who carry names on their chests, in the way we gather when no one is trending, in the stories we tell even when no one is listening." She looked directly at the mothers in the front row. Today is not about the politics of who shows up. It's about the courage of those who never stopped even when it cost them everything. A breeze picked up, lifting the edges of her speech notes. She didn't hold them down. She let them lift. She looked out again, this time past the cameras. There was no handshake. But I didn't come for a hand. I came for the names. When she stepped down, no applause was asked for. Still it rose like a tide, slow, steady, rising from the back until it filled the silence left behind. Trump never stood. She never looked back. The day was quiet, almost too quiet for Washington. Most offices had emptied early for the weekend. Staffers had gone home. The halls of the Cannon House office building were mostly silent, save for the occasional echo of a cleaning cart rolling over old tile. AOC sat alone in her office, surrounded by boxes. Not of policy, not of press materials, just pieces of time. Old folders, scuffed notebooks, a button from her first campaign, a worn-out post-it that read, "Speak, even if your voice shakes." She opened the bottom drawer of her desk. It creaked like it hadn't been touched in years. Inside, beneath a stack of campaign mail, was a small envelope with a child's handwriting in purple ink. The return address, Tucson, Arizona. No date, just a name scribbled in the corner, Ureli, age 10. She unfolded the single page carefully like it might break. "Hi, AOC. My name is Ureli and I'm 10. My mom says you're brave because you say hard things. I told my class you are like a superhero without a cape." My teacher laughed, but I didn't care. One day I'll say 11 words too. I don't know what they are yet, but they'll matter. AOC froze. It had been nearly a year since she stood in that room and said the words that turned into a rallying cry. Power is loudest when it tries hardest to silence the truth. She didn't plan them, didn't practice them, but they stuck. To hear them echoed back, now filtered through the heart of a 10-year-old girl, not in a protest sign, not on a t-shirt, but in a simple piece of notebook paper, it was too much. Her eyes welled. She pressed the letter against her chest as if holding it closer could stop her from shaking. But it didn't, because this wasn't about her. It was about all the girls named Ureli who didn't grow up seeing themselves at podiums. It was about every brown-skinned child whose voice was dismissed before it was even heard. It was about letters like this one, letters that didn't need approval ratings or airtime to matter. She whispered almost to herself, "They already do matter." In that moment, she wasn't Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She was just Alex, a girl from the Bronx, daughter of a house cleaner, who once thought speaking out meant you had to yell. But here was proof that sometimes power was quiet. It lived in a letter, in a hope, in 11 words not yet spoken but already written on someone's heart. She stood up slowly, walked over to the bulletin board above her desk, and pinned Ureli's letter next to a faded photo of her mother. Then she turned off the light, letting the room go dim except for that single paper still fluttering slightly in the breath of the air vent, like it was still speaking. Sometimes the greatest victories are the ones no one claps for. AOC didn't walk out to cheering crowds or camera flashes. She walked out in silence with the quiet strength of someone who chose truth over comfort. That's what makes her story unforgettable. It reminds us that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a single voice standing firm when others walk away. This isn't just about politics. It's about the kind of world we want to leave behind, one where young girls like Ureli can grow up knowing their voice matters, even if it shakes. In a time when it's easy to stay quiet, she chose to speak, and that choice still echoes. What about you? Have you ever stayed silent when you wished you had spoken up, or found the strength to speak even when no one was listening? We'd love to hear your story. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.